This over here is the RTX 4070. And what we have on this side is the AMD RX 7800 XT. And they're both roughly about the same price. The Nvidia card is actually a little bit more expensive. But in terms of creative applications, which one is better? Well, let's find out.
Looking for a cheap way to license your Windows? Check out Whokeys through the links in the video description. Make sure to use the code TN20 to get a 30% off. Paste the license to the activation settings and you're all done. This license is for Windows 10, but you can upgrade it to Windows 11 for free. They also offer Microsoft Office 19 license. Use the same code TN20 to get a 30% off. Check out whokeys.com in the video description below.
Firstly, I'd like to mention the price because that's where things get a little bit more interesting. The price right now, what I'm looking at, the AMD card is actually between 400 to 450, some of the higher end and lower end models. The Zotac card is between 550 and 620, so there's between 50 to maybe up to $100 difference depending which 4070 you're going to go for, difference between these two. The Zotac also has a 2-fan one, and some other companies have the same as well. I don't think there is a 2-fan 7800 XT available there. I can't see that. You can see that the TUF or the AMD card is actually a bigger, but it doesn't have to be bigger. It just has a massive cooler here. As you can see, the PCB, if you're looking at the back sides of this, so all of this bit here, you can see they've cut a little notch in for the BIOS switch there. The PCB just ends there, so there's like an inch of extra where they don't have that on the 4070. But the card is a bit longer as well. If you look, the pass-through isn't as much as here on the Zotac. We have huge pass-through for the third fan. In terms of thickness of these cards, they're both about the same, 2.5, almost 3 slots thick cards, probably 3 slots just to be safe. But the power connectors are different. The Nvidia card has the 12-volt high power connector there, which actually comes with a splitter to 2 PCIe 8-pin cables, which are exactly the same on the Radeon here. We've got 8 PCIe power plugs in there, but here we have that type of connector. So the good thing is that if you do have a power supply that's ATX 3.0, then you can have a cable that goes directly into there without the AMD or the Nvidia connector or converter cable. But if you have one of the older power supplies and you just want to put a new card in, you're just gonna have a little dongle there, which might not look the nicest. But then let's take a look at the specs. We can see the different namings of these GPUs, but firstly, the process node. And interestingly, the Nvidia has a monolithic basically GPU, so everything is on just one die and that's it. Whereas AMD actually has a bit of a glue together approach, what they have also on their CPUs, where they glue different dies together. So the IO die and some of the things that don't actually need like the latest, more expensive process node from TSMC, both of them use TSMC by the way as well, then they're using the 5nm for their actual calculating a GPU, graphics power, and then the other bits that don't actually necessarily need the more nanometers or the more expensive die, they're using 6nm there. So 6 and 5nm different things glued there together for this GPU. In terms of shading units, TMU's RT cores, AMD and Nvidia call them a little bit differently, and this is kind of a vague comparison there. They're not exactly comparable to each other, but just interesting to show you something there. But you can see that the shading units, AMD has less, but then TMUs and RT cores, the AMD has more than the RTX 4070. In terms of the die size, you can see that AMD has a bigger die as well. The bigger the die, the more it costs, the more expensive it is. But interestingly, the AMD card seems to be the cheaper one here. In terms of memory type, the 4070 uses the GDDR6X, whereas the 7800 XT is just GDDR6. With the AMD card, we get 16 gigs of VRAM compared to the 12 what you have on the 4070. The memory bus is higher on the AMD as well as the memory bandwidth. The bus interface is the same PCIe Gen 4 X16 slot, and the TDP is rated 263 on the AMD and 200 on the Nvidia, but the max card power draw, AMD draws even more, 276, but the Nvidia 201, or actually 295. In terms of the price right now, depending which model you're interested in, whether you want the smaller one or the bigger ones, or 2 fans, white, black, there's loads of different designs available. Go check out the latest pricing in the description below. There you can also find my GPU test bench setup if you're wondering like what's the other components in the system. But both of these have been tested just recently, so let's take a look. Firstly, Geekbench 6. Here we can see that the Nvidia card is about 23% faster in the OpenCL scores and about 4.4% faster in the Vulkan scores. But moving on to photo editing. In Adobe Photoshop, we can see that the 4070 is 6.3% slower in the overall score, about 21.6% slower in the GPU score, about the same in general score, and the filter score is about 15% slower. So you can see the AMD card gets a big win here. In Lightroom Classic, really both of these cards perform roughly about the same. I'd say that the AMD card has a bit of an advantage of the extra VRAM, where depending on which photos or when you zoom in right in, you might, run out of 12 gigabytes, but 12 gigabytes is plenty as well, and I don't see Nvidia performing any worse or better in Lightroom Classic when you actually do the benchmark. So they're about the same there. In video editing now, and this is where things get a bit interesting. Now, in Premiere Pro, the RTX 4070 is about 4% slower in the extended overall scores and about 11.2% slower in the standard overall score. Now that is quite a big win for AMD, but let's take a little deeper look inside. The long GOP score is about 20% slower and about 25% slower on the Nvidia card on standard and extended scores, which means that those media engines on the AMD card there are pretty impressive. The interframe score here is again about 13 to 14% slower on the AMD card. That means if you're working with H.264, H.265, then the AMD card is actually better, whether encoding or decoding the footage. In terms of the raw score now, the 4070 is actually about 5.6% faster in the extended scores and about 2.5% slower in the standard scores. So even though we have less VRAM and the extended bit would be where it would actually be slower, the AMD is the one that actually gets a loss in the extended scores. Now, when we're looking at the GPU effects, then that's where Nvidia is a bit better. The actual GPU effects, 17% faster in the extended GPU effects score, but about 0.6% slower in the GPU effects standard score. So in the standard score, about the same in GPU effects. So using Premiere Pro, you can see that the AMD card is absolutely definitely worth considering, and the driver updates since the beginning of this year have really improved the AMD performance in all of these things, utilizing the media engines and encoders and so on. That's impressive. Moving on to After Effects, and here actually Nvidia is quite a bit faster, 7.5% faster in the overall scores. The GPU score is slightly slower, but the RAM preview, render, and tracking scores are all better on the Nvidia. Moving on to DaVinci Resolve, we can see that the 4070 is quite a bit slower here. The extended overall score is about 13.5% slower. Standard overall score is about 17.6% slower. The 4K media score 5% slower, but the 8K media score, interestingly, about 16.7% faster, which is interesting. I would have expected this to be faster just because it's got more VRAM, faster GPU, so it should be faster, but interestingly in 8K media score, the Nvidia is a bit better. In GPU effects score, they're roughly about the same, Nvidia only about 1.1% faster. In Fusion, again, this is the biggest win that the AMD gets over Nvidia. The RTX 4070 is 25% slower, which is insane. So if you're not doing RAW or 8K, then the AMD is pretty much better at every single aspect in video editing. If you're doing RAW or 8K, then perhaps considering Nvidia is the one. But depending on your workflow, the AMD is definitely not a card to just neglect for video editing, because I am very impressed with some of these benchmarks now. Let's take a look at 3D. In V-Ray, unfortunately, we don't have support for AMD Radeon cards for V-Ray. If we are looking at Blender, that's where we get, support for both sides. And here, that's where things fall apart really for AMD. The RTX 4070 is 185% faster, almost 3 times as fast as the 7800 XT. 166 or 185% faster in the junk shop and classroom scenes. That's absolutely insane. Moving on to Octanebench, and the story is about the same, that we don't have support for Radeon. But there is support for Redshift for both of these cards. But again, the RTX 4070 is 78% faster than the Radeon 7800 XT. So In general, for 3D, the AMD card really isn't anything amazing yet. And bear in mind, I was testing Blender 4.0 there. We should have better and better support for AMD with their HIP and all of this technology, but still Nvidia is so much further ahead with all the 3D. So if you're doing 3D, Nvidia is the clear choice. If you're doing video editing though, I think for 90% of the people at this budget range, the 7800 XT is actually a fantastic card in most of the things that you do. In certain aspects, the 4070 is still better. There's one thing to consider, which is the encoding performance and quality. Now, in terms of the performance, you can see that AMD is better, but the quality is something what I've seen people actually complain about. And I'd love to know your experience in the comment section below. But there is a bit of a rumor, or AMD is known to have a bit lesser quality encoders compared to the Nvidia ones. You might have to export the video at a higher bitrate to get the similar kind of results with Nvidia. I haven't tested it yet, so I'm actually kind of just speculating here, and I'd love to hear from you what you think in the comment section below, your experience. That would be massively helpful in here. But it's very hard to test the quality of the encoder like just by eye, because that's not a very, you know, measurable. One might look better here or there, so I'm not sure how to test the encoding quality. For photo editing, I'd say, you know, both of them are completely fine, and I would actually go with the cheaper one, because if you're a photo editor, you don't actually need something like this. It's just useless, and you're spending more money that you don't actually get any performance. I'd like to get the 16 gigabytes of VRAM instead, and actually it's better as well in video photo editing than the 4070. And if you'd like to check out some new merch, check it out in the video description below, technodistore.com. There it is. And if you're wondering which PC to build, then check out the build guides in the description below. Now, knowing this result, you might want to change, depending on your workflow, some of the GPUs in some of my build guides, because my build guide is kind of generally creators trying to accomplish all of the things like photo, video, 3D. But now, if you're only video editor, the Radeon card is the one to get over this 4070. I'll leave both of these in the description below, as well as the build guides, which you can see there as well. Thanks guys for watching. Bye bye.